The speakers for the session, myself and Eoin Haugh, who led the working party, and the other members, just to give them a shout out, Anne-Marie Crowley, 𝗧𝗶𝘁𝗹𝗲 Griffin and Caroline Toomey, and I'd like to acknowledge the work that they put into the framework. So the agenda for this session, brief recap on the introduction earlier, a little bit more about how the framework evolved, what the detail looks like, and then I'll hand over to Eoin. He's going to cover the consultation with committees and committee members so far. There was a survey done as part of that exercise, and he'll just explain the rationale for that and give some information on what the response from that survey looked like, and then we'll open it up to discussion. So these are the slides earlier. That's the competency wheel. You should get familiar with that over time, hopefully. And then these were the various one-sentence descriptions of each of the 15 competencies, the skills, attributes, and knowledge. So just to take a step back a little in terms of when the working party, in fact, sat with a blank piece of paper wondering how to meet this objective, I suppose there was a bit of research done both in terms of what a competency framework should look like, points to consider, as well as what some of the other professional bodies already have in place. So this is just a list that I pulled off Google, I think, the usual source of information in the world, but I think it was a sensible kind of list to consider in terms of trying to be simple, having simple language, a good structure, relevant for all the people who would be expected to use it, that it should be durable, allowing for potential changes in roles in the future. There should be no duplications or repetition of competencies. I think each competency needs to kind of be clear in itself as to what the scope of that is. And so, equally, the same point really, behaviour should be distinct, describing one aspect or one behaviour. So moving on then just to some of the other frameworks that do already exist in actuarial professional bodies elsewhere. The US society has this framework which comprises 8 competencies. You'll see you could probably map our framework to it to a large extent. I suppose interestingly they have leadership as a separate competency. We would include that within our collaboration. They have communication and professional values as well, and they have strategic insight and integration is another one that's interesting. I guess within our framework, there's probably different elements of that are actually isolated in ours, probably around judgment, decision making, and maybe a bit of data analysis. The Australian Actuaries Institute, then, it also has a framework made up of 8 competencies, and again, it's similar to the US society. It has leadership as a separate competency, and professional governance. And then I haven't actually seen what's behind this. This is all you can see on the public version of the website. So I'm not sure to what extent then some of the competencies are designed to be specific, for specific roles. For example, you can see there's product development and pricing, and then separately there's investment advice and governance, and then there's valuing uncertain future cash flows. So I don't know to what extent the attention is that, you might just focus on one of those if you have a valuation role or a product development role, for example. Moving closer to home then, within the UK profession, they do capture some competency information, I suppose, both at the pre-qualification stage and then at the practicing certificate stage. So you may be aware that recently they've replaced their work-based skills requirement that forms part of the qualification route with what they call personal and professional development competencies, and they're broken down into 3 different categories, which are shown there. They have 31 individual competencies in total within those 3 categories, so they are quite specific, kind of granular descriptions of pieces of work that have to be completed and evidenced, I suppose. And within that, there are 4 mandatory competencies as a whole. There's a minimum number of credits that you have to gain annually, and then a minimum overall number to qualify as an associate and a fellow. And then at the other end of the scale, for practicing certificate holders, again, they describe these as examples of competencies, but they are specified for 5 separate roles. And just as an example, they go into quite a bit of detail. But the key skills for a chief actuary are listed in the table there. So split between 3 categories: business, knowledge, awareness and understanding, and technical skills. And then, at a lower level than that, for each of those key skills, there would be specific skills defined within that. So as I've given an example there of judgment being the further detail in terms of impartiality, uncertainty, challenge, and pragmatism. So there is a lot of detail in that. And then just one other framework that you might notice some similarity with ours, but I'm sure we were influenced probably somewhat by this model, I would acknowledge. So this is the Institute of Directors Competency Framework, and it was only launched, I think, fairly recently at the time the Working Party started to get going. But it was one, the model itself, I think, appealed that they have knowledge, skills, and mindset. So moving on then, I suppose part of the objective that was set was to define competencies for various roles. So I guess the Working Party had to grapple with, well, what does that mean, various roles? What's expected? So the initial approach really was to think about career stage, and the most obvious, I suppose, stages to consider were, student, recent qualifier, mid-career, and then a senior member. And so quite a bit of work was done into kind of fleshing out what that model would look for each of the individual competencies. And I've just shown for an example there of how the modelling competency was looking based on the work that was done at that time. But it was throwing up a few issues for us. And ultimately we did reject that approach. And I suppose one of them, there were several. One was that the hierarchical structure was almost implied in the way that work would be managed. So if you look at modelling, it's almost expected that the student would be there labouring away, making sure that all the controls were in place, and then, potentially that work being reviewed or overseen by someone mid-career. And that kind of almost immediately started bringing in some management skills into that competency. And similarly then for a senior member, it says there ensures model compliance with actuarial guidelines, so the actuarial standards started kind of creeping in there. So it wasn't really helping isolate the different competencies. We were finding that they were overlapping, as well as assuming this kind of hierarchical structure, which isn't necessarily appropriate for smaller organisations or maybe matrix structures and then also, I think another key issue we had was just around the different types of roles that exist for actuaries. So, somebody who's a Haugh in terms of what level of modelling competency they'd require, well, they'd certainly need to understand the models, know what sort of controls should be in place, etc. But somebody who's maybe specialising in modelling, who might be at an earlier stage of their career, might be a lot more competent, particularly if they were, I suppose, dealing with quite sophisticated statistical models. So ultimately, I suppose, and equally, I guess, if you look at the syllabus for any of the actuarial exams, you'll probably, if you've qualified quite a few years ago, as I did, you'll probably realise that, you know, if you haven't been using that particular skill or knowledge, it's probably quite far back in your brain. So there's a use it or lose it principle, and so, you know, it's not just a one-way ticket moving up through the, you know, from student through to senior member, whatever that means. It's, you know, your competency can fall back as well, depending on what you're actually using and what your role requires. So the revised approach then is in line with the final, you know, the full detail of the current competency framework. Essentially, it was to define a spectrum for each competency from low to high, and recognise that any individual can score high in some competencies and low in others at any career stage. It just really depends on what their role involves. So, as I said, it allows for competency to decline. And, you know, some of the specialist technical skills, you know, probably usually decline over time if people move to kind of more general management type roles. But they kind of supplement them then with other, you know, collaboration competencies, etc., resilience, and some of the other areas of the wheel. And I think one key advantage we saw of this different approach of having a spectrum from low to high was that we could see how that could quite easily facilitate career development, because you could compare your own personal competency profile with another role that you might aspire to, and just consider, you know, what areas you might need to skill up on. So in terms of that spectrum from low to high, we ultimately decided that there should be 3 different levels. There was quite a bit of debate about what we should call those levels. You know, low, medium and high was a definite possibility. But I suppose ultimately what has been agreed is that we will describe them as core, expert and master. And really they're just indications of different, I suppose, stage points within the competency spectrum. And the idea is that core, you know, reflects foundational competencies that a member might acquire early in their career. The expert level reflects a high standard of competency, you know, where a member is kind of fully proficient in practice, but they might be expert at in several different areas, I guess. And master is intended to reflect a competency, a depth of knowledge and skill, where that, you know, where potentially that's the individual's main focus or their specialist area, and that has been built up over quite a number of years as well. So just to move on then, so you will have seen the word cloud in the plenary presentation, and that was essentially made up of all the words that are in the tables. So for each competency in the framework, there's a table that looks like this. The text in bold is the 1-sentence definition of the competency. Then aspects to consider in italics is really designed to kind of prompt consideration of all aspects of that competency, and to, in some ways, kind of define the intended scope of the competency so that we avoid this, you know, possibility of kind of scope creep, or that we're clear on what is included where in the wheel, I guess. And then you'll see the core, expert and master sections of the table are color-coded, and I guess the color there is designed to demonstrate that, I suppose, the competencies are cumulative, so someone at the expert level is really expected, or would be expected to have most or all of the core competencies already, and similarly with master. And I guess, so this example is just data analysis. I suppose in terms of the words that are in there, we did kind of draw on, you know, data analytics expert information, I suppose, or, you know, general information about data analysis itself, rather than being solely focused on kind of what the actuarial concept of data analysis might be. So again, the intention is that the framework should be generic and be capable of being applied outside traditional industry areas. Here's another example then, just in the attributes category, collaboration. And again, the aspects to consider, it's, you know, it's clear, or it's intended to be clear, I suppose, you know, exactly the scope of that. So it includes inclusiveness, teamwork, relationship management and leadership, and I suppose peer review as well, which would be an important aspect for regulated functions. Again, I think that, you know, the same format in terms of core, expert and master, and the different descriptions of behaviours. And then finally, moving on to an example from the knowledge category, we have functional expertise. And as I mentioned in the plenary session, I suppose this is very much dependent on the particular role someone has. So and again, the descriptions are very generic, because, you know, if you're dealing with anything from audit to operations to just general management, you know, it's difficult to come up with a set of words that's going to apply. So it is very general wording, but I think it can be applied in practice. So now I'm going to hand over to Eoin just to go through the consultation process.
Thanks, Sheelagh. So this is intended to kind of showcase the competency framework as we intended to operate, and one of the things we're really trying to show is this kind of core expert master view, and in particular on communications, we're looking to show the two ends of the spectrum. So Sheelagh's just showed the core side, or the master side of communications. I'm going to now bring you back and show you what the core side looks like in terms of what you're about to see for the next few minutes. So the consultation process itself has been going on for a very long time. We've been engaging with council on this topic very much since the beginning, so for about 18 months now. But we also engaged throughout the process with several other groups of stakeholders. We met with 𝗧𝗶𝘁𝗶𝘁𝗲𝗏, who's the head of learning for the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, who saw, admittedly, a somewhat earlier iteration of this, and was very much impressed with the direction of travel, and it was aligned to their thinking, which they haven't really gotten around to putting on paper yet, around what they want for their whole of life profession version of this. We've had engagement from some individual members who gave some really good insights, particularly around some of the detail, and some great feedback on the detail thing, ranging from how we have far too much detail to how we've far too little detail. So we've tried to incorporate the feedback, but obviously in some instances when we're getting feedback from the two ends of the spectrum, it's not been possible to bring it all together, but where possible we have. The main feedback we've gotten in the last 6 months has been from the various committees of the SAI. So this has come in two forms. At committee meetings, we brought along the framework, presented them, had some very good discussions and suggestions from the committees about what we might do. But following on from that, we had a survey of sorts, which I'll touch in a moment, which gave us some really good insights as well. The feedback has been around the level of detail, what competencies we've chosen to include or exclude. As Sheelagh alluded to, we haven't included leadership because we think it's included in the collaboration piece, but it's something that I think we had to call out more and more as being, you know, it's there, it's just not badged. And then about the purpose of the framework, and in particular, one of the things we want to call out and emphasise is that the framework is not seeking to introduce a new requirement on members. This is about assisting members to most effectively and efficiently meet the existing CPD requirements. It's not looking to give people an additional thing they have to do. It's to help do the things that we already do a little bit better. So on the committee survey, firstly, I'd like to say thank you to all of the committee members and some in the room who responded to this. We got 43 individual responses altogether. So thank you on two counts. Firstly, it's been really useful to us on the working group in helping us put together the kind of final iteration of the presentation. And secondly, for myself, thank you, because I'll be standing up here with nothing to talk about for 10 minutes if I didn't have your response to share back with you. So what did the survey entail? It was effectively 3 bits. There was a piece around who you are. So how long have you been a member of the society? What's your current role? What you do? We looked at the profile question, and we were kind of wondering what do we ask around the duration, and we went with the number of years that you've been a member of the society rather than the number of years post-qualification, because we really want this to be a framework for all members of society, whether they're students or otherwise. And if we went with a question on PQE, we'd have to include negative numbers, which is never great, and we'd have to ask students, how long do you think it's going to be till you qualify, which isn't a very fair question. And so on to the survey itself. So firstly, in terms of what we had, as I say, 43 responses from a relatively diverse group of people. When you look at the different sectors, we had people from life, non-life, pensions, and wider fields. So we had good diversity of coverage, good diversity by gender. We did have a slight bias towards people who've been with the society for longer and for people who are in kind of more senior roles in the organisation. So when we're looking at the detailed results in a minute, it's important to have that context in mind. We're talking about committee members who are maybe longer with the society, and you would expect they're perhaps more developed in some of these competencies than the average member. I sometimes wonder when I'm looking at presentations how many people have prepared their slides well in advance and who did it right before. I definitely didn't do these over lunch because I have a slide on behavioural economics, which had I attended the plenary I probably wouldn't have included. Paul gave a much better presentation on this than I'm ever going to, so I'll maybe touch on a few of the points I was going to make. I don't know if any of you read the Journal of Accident Analysis and Prevention, but if any of you don't and are planning to, there's going to be a few spoilers. Routine way of getting a paper published in that particular journal is to ask a whole bunch of people, how good are you at driving? They'll give you an answer, you then sit them in a car and you measure how good they are at driving. The spoiler's coming now. They're not as good as they think they are. And it's for a lot of the reasons that Paul was talking about earlier. I was going to talk about System 1 and System 2 thinking, but I think Paul's definition of the elephant and the rider was a lot more colourful and a lot more memorable. The elephant's making a lot of the decisions when you're doing things really quickly and without thinking. And these heuristics, the cognitive shortcuts, have a lot to do with it. The reason I'm mentioning this at all is that when we're talking about the survey results, and indeed when people are trying to use the competency framework, this is your own assessment of what you think is required for a role or where you think you currently are. And these self-assessments are going to be influenced by these cognitive shortcuts. One of the things that's going to apply is this idea of representativeness. So this is use of categories. So Excel is a tool that I can use for data analysis. I'm good with Excel, hence I'm good at data analysis. It's a shortcut. If we spend a bit of time thinking about it, we won't make that mistake. But if you're trying to do this in a kind of a System 1 view or letting the elephant do the thinking, you can end up with a quick answer. Likewise with availability. If I do the competency framework tomorrow, I'll be thinking, oh, I did a presentation yesterday. I must be good at presentations. My communication score is really up. Whereas if you haven't done one recently, it won't immediately come to mind, won't come in. And anchoring, not something we're going to see in the survey results, hopefully, because nobody had any anchor 2. But if I'm looking at a particular competency and saying, everyone who's been a member of society for 6 to 10 years is in the range of 45 to 55, where's my score going to fall? Probably not too far away from the 45 to 55 range. So when you are trying to use this tool yourself, and hopefully we all do, just be mindful to take the time to kind of fully think through, are you avoiding some of these kind of common pitfalls. In terms of the competencies, Sheelagh introduced the terminology we're using around core, expert, and master. These aren't kind of equal buckets in in some sense. The way we've put it in the scoring system is that core runs from 0 to 25, expert runs from 25 to 75, and master runs from 75 to 100. This is deliberate. This is to reflect the fact that we expect that people will, by and large, get from core to expert in a reasonably short space of time. But actually, the gap from from entering into the expert bucket to entering into the master bucket is really a much broader one. So there's an expectation that there's a lot of work required to get from expert up to master, and consequent to that, also a realization that that expert bucket is going to cover people who are a little bit expert to a lot of experts. So there'll be a lot of diversity in that bucket as well. Just to explain the chart, which I should have done, the bars are reflecting the total range. So what did we get in the survey results from top to bottom? So the bottom of the bar is the lowest result, the top of the bar is the highest result, and the little diamonds are the average score that we saw. By and large, and again possibly reflecting the sample that we were looking at, there's very little that falls into the score range, but the full spectrum of the expert range is used, and we found people in the mastery space in all of them. I'm going to go into all these in a bit more detail later, so I'm not going to call out the individual ones here. Another way of looking at this is to start thinking about how long have people been in the society, and what does that mean in terms of the various ranges that they look like. So exactly the same picture. We're talking, depending on your duration with society, the bar being the highest and lowest scores, the diamond being the average score. And we see the pattern that we kind of expect to see. And there's, I guess, two things I want to call out. By and large, the average is moving up as you move over the chart. So you've seen people getting better and better with more experience. But coming back to Sheilagh's point earlier on use it or lose it, when you get to this kind of later stage, you're seeing that for some of the competencies around data analysis, modelling, solution design, for some of the more senior members, that number is coming back down. So this is kind of what we expect to see as you're moving through your career and not using some of those kind of more practical skills. These might come down, but there'll be other things such as the communication, risk management, judgment, and so on that you would expect to continue to see go up. So that kind of gradual progression towards the right as you move through the early stage of your career, followed by maybe a pull back to the left for some particular competencies when you get later into your career is what we were expecting to see. I'm going to go quickly through the results for the skills, knowledge, and attributes, just calling out, I guess, some of the key things we saw that were maybe more interesting, and skills. So this is the things we do or the things we think we can do. My favourite thing from the result is our highest score. Across the 15 competencies, we're best at communication. We're better at communication than we are at risk management or modelling, which I thought was very interesting results. One other thing to note, you see it here in this one and also later on the industry issues. The one we don't really get to the very top of in this one is data analysis. And I think this partially comes back to this biases piece that we were talking about earlier. I think we all know and recognise that there's lots of new stuff going on in data analysis that we don't know. So we know there's stuff we don't know, which I think is what brings the score down. If there was similar things in other areas, do we know that we don't know everything, and are we scoring ourselves appropriately? I think is a fair question that we should challenge ourselves to when we're trying to utilise the framework. So the attributes, how we're going to behave, I think this by and large follows what I was expecting. Everything is scoring quite well. Resilience very high. Judgment, accountability, again reflective of the fact that we're talking about committee members, senior executives in firms and so on. These are the competencies we expect them to score very highly in. And then finally moving on to knowledge. I think there's kind of a nice narrative here if you kind of follow this way around. So if we start with functional expertise, by and large, we're really good at what we do. So when someone's thinking about the particular role that they're involved in, they're really good at it. The commercial awareness really builds from that. So really good at what we do, and we know why it's important. We know why it helps our firm succeed. And then on to industry issues. We understand what's going on in the broader picture that allows us to apply those functional expertise to make money for our companies. Regulatory matters didn't score quite so well. If I was here with my central bank hat, I'd want to know who those 4 people were. But I'm not, so I'll move on. When we go on to the actuarial standards, I was a bit surprised. And again, thinking through it and trying to understand, Paul spoke earlier about hindsight bias. Hindsight bias, you can explain anything after the event. I wouldn't have guessed beforehand, but we've got a lot of people who are kind of saying, I've kind of got a middling understanding of actuarial standards. And we're talking about committee members here. We're talking about the people who draft and recommend these for council for approval. So I was a bit surprised to see it. But again, perhaps in hindsight, this is people recognising, okay, I know the actuarial standard I've just written, and given the detail and understanding I have of that, I know how little I know about the other ones. So I think that's possibly what's going on there. And then just briefly before I pass back to Sheelagh, I want to touch on two of the individual profiles we looked at. So we tried to see when we try and group people together, we're looking here, firstly at INEDs, and then we'll move on to C-suite members in a moment. What do people think is required to do their role? And it touches on, I guess, kind of the things you'd expect. So what does INED expect? As is A2 and A4 are the key ones. Collaboration, they need to be able to work together as a board and indeed with the companies that work. And judgment, they need to be able to make sound and valid judgments on around the board table of what they need to do for their firms. And again, we see this kind of pullback of certain technical skills. So in this case, data analysis, modelling, solution design is lower for the director population than we see elsewhere. And again, this kind of makes intuitive sense as you've moved on through the career. You've probably got a situation for a lot of these people where had you asked them the same question 5 or 10 years ago, these would have been much higher, but they come back over time. And then we go to the C-suite. I should have done an animation here so we could jump between the two and see how it kind of expands and contracts, but I didn't, so lesson learned for next time. Again, you're seeing a lot of the things that you would expect to see. There's a lot of resilience. So these guys have jobs where they're often having to deal with difficult situations, difficult stakeholders, and again, the commercial awareness, knowledge of professional standards and regulatory matters are really, really high for this population. So I'm just going to hand back to Sheelagh on next steps.